Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started here as soon as John is connected on audio. We have all our panelists here. Hopefully you can see my slides. The first thing we're going to do is just go around and ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. I'm Howard Ting. I'm the CEO of Cyberhaven. We're a company in the data protection market, and we are thrilled to have all of you here with us today, and we also are very excited about our esteemed panel here. So let me just give them a chance to introduce themselves. Mark, why don't you go first? Just tell everyone about yourself and how you ended up here.
The first part's easy, I don't know about the second. I'm a 7-time CIO. I've worked in a variety of public companies, ranging from most recently Okta, which I joined pre-IPO. It was small to much larger companies like Visa and Air Electronics and Occidental Oil and Gas. So I've worked in a variety of industries, and I'm based out in California in the Bay Area. And I have the opportunity now to actually spend a fair amount of time advising a number of startup companies and working with some friends in the venture capital community.
Great, thanks, Mark. Yaron?
I'm Yaron Levy. I'm the CISO for Dolby. I've been here about 3 months now. Prior to that, I was the CISO for Blue Cross Blue Shield. I'm based out of Kansas City, and was working in the Bay Area also in my past. I worked for Intuit, I worked for eBay, but I'm based out of here. That's actually one of the good things about COVID. I didn't have to relocate, so I'm going to work for remote and then travel when everything opens up back up. Also working with several VCs and startup companies on just various security innovations and things like that.
Great, thanks, Ron. And John?
Hi, everybody. I'm John Bodorf. I'm a senior manager of cyber tools at Western Digital. Been in the industry for 20 odd years. Came from an actual architecture background and then switched into the IT security world. And worked at Western Digital, worked for Ingram Micro and a number of other larger companies for a long time. So glad to be here.
Great, thank you. And we have a bunch of great folks that register for the event. Some of these folks are already here, and I'm sure more will show up later. But thank you all for being here. I think we've got just an amazing roster of accounts here from very diverse businesses and obviously very different company sizes as well. So thank you all for participating. And just one quick final housekeeping announcement. We sent all of the registrants a link to accept a gift, and if you don't want the gift, you can actually donate it to the COVID relief charity. So please go ahead and take the time to do that. If you're not able to accept it, let's just help the folks that really need help right now. So let me start by asking Mark. Mark wrote an amazing paper just published earlier this year that he calls Data Misuse Protection. If you want to link to that paper, you can find it on the Cyberhaven blog, and if you just search Mark's name, I'm sure it'll pop up. He wrote this amazing paper with one of the venture capitalists, really articulating a great perspective about why data protection needs to evolve. And I wanted to just start, Mark, with you. Just kind of tell us, why did you write this paper? What was your thinking behind it? What did you observe in your roles as the top IT leader for so many amazing companies? And just give us a little bit of the genesis behind that.
There were two motivations. I co-wrote the paper with Sid Trivedi over at Foundation Capital, and he and I, over beers, have been very critical of the DLP industry that's grown up, the data loss prevention industry that's in place today for a variety of reasons. And so we kind of got off our butts and we did something about it by actually putting this paper together. So I guess, when we look at the problem of data management, and really more specifically privacy data, there's current solutions I think are flawed, in two respects. One is they're really designed to prevent data loss. And they don't really address issues of probably, equal significance and potential liability associated with the misuse of data that's been obtained through consent agreements, with so-called data subjects, as they'd be referred to in GDPR regulations. And so, you can find ways to shoot yourself in the foot through misusing or using data that's, never intended by the person that submitted it, it could be in ways that are, unethical or never intended, open to the same kind of liabilities that you would be if there was actually a breach or a loss of data. So, I mean, observation number one is just because the data stayed within the four walls of the corporation, doesn't mean that it's safe for misuse. And then secondly, and this is, I think, a pretty kind of an obvious observation that's certainly not original to me, but our data loss prevention tools have really grown up with this idea of defending security perimeters. And in the evolution, they really were grounded in perimeters that were defined by elements of infrastructure, whether it was an application firewall, a network, an endpoint, even the more recent interest in identity authentication and authorization privilege management. The people are the perimeter, and so we're going to defend that perimeter. And it's kind of fundamentally a broken concept. I was at a conference a couple of months ago, and the head of Splunk, the CEO of Splunk, said security perimeters are dead, like they don't really exist anymore. And you really need to enforce your least privilege principles at that point of service invocation, wherever that occurs, whatever set of infrastructure elements are in play at the time that some kind of a user, or even a non-human user. I mean, that's really going to be the next perimeter if you stay with this kind of mindset or philosophy that you're trying to defend. Now you have machine identities. Machines are actually interacting with databases and applications and doing things again in ways that may violate whatever terms and conditions were associated with the way data was originally collected. So I think it's those two things. It's the expanding your mind to wrap around what the implications are when you are managing privacy data, and unwrapping your mind from the security perimeter defenses that are grounded in infrastructure elements.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think you're touching on a number of very important points there. Just the need to rethink our approach to this problem, rethink what the problem really is. Even what we call this category, data loss prevention. You make the point in the paper, the data doesn't need to be lost to do damage and do harm to your company. So I'm curious, Joran, maybe you can pick up from here. How are you changing your thoughts about what this problem really is and how to approach the problem?
Yeah, so I think DLP is one of those things that sounds like a great idea, but I think as an industry we failed miserably. To go and implement that, and there are many reasons for that, I think. But what part of it is, I think there is this notion of, I don't know if I blame marketing people for that or if it was just our wishful thinking. But there is this notion of like, you're going to have a box on your network. And once you have that box, nothing is going to leave your network without you knowing about it. And that doesn't work. I remember having conversations in past life, and internal audits came to me and said, hey, we think that we need to have a DLP. And I said, why? And they said, well, because we don't want to lose anything that's going to leave, especially in a heavily regulated industry like in healthcare, where I came from. And I said, well, let me ask you a few questions. Forget the box, or forget the tool, or forget the technology. What are we doing when it comes to access control? What are we kind of doing? Information lifecycle management, data classification, et cetera, et cetera. And the answer, we're not mature there yet. So for me, DLP is not very much, the tool or the box like most people think about. It's more the process, and it's more the approach. It's more the practice. And I think that disconnect between the two of how we take that practice and connect it back to a technology at the end, that's kind of where we're falling short, because we start with the tool, we don't start with the practice.
It's a great point. And if we just think about the tools for a minute, and I want to get back to the practice and the philosophy in a minute, but John, maybe you can share with us kind of what do you think are the most common reasons why these tools fail to under-deliver or fail to deliver against expectations? Are the expectations wrong, or are there fundamental gaps or deficiencies with the way that these tools work, given the way that users share information and use information today?
I think Yaron touched on it briefly, right? Is a lot of it is the expectation from management, your HR, your legal, is that you'll bring in this tool and it will magically protect your data, but there's never a program in place beforehand to actually define what is the data you are trying to protect, to classify that data, to, you either grade it, depending on your organization by, top secret down or however you want to do it. But, there has to be an understanding of what data are you really trying to protect, and protect it from what. Back in the old days, right, it was much easier before remote work, where all your data was in a data center, usually like on your own site. Users had to come onto the site, sit down at their desktop. There was no VPN. It was much easier to control that data. It was easy to define what your data is, and you're going to protect it. It's not going to leave. Well, now with, all the cloud platforms and data and APIs, data is everywhere, and we're tying ourselves into so much data in so many different places, and it's all flowing in and out. And from a product standpoint, the idea that I'm going to bring in some product that's going to magically track all of that is just not realistic. So from the very beginning, when you start conversations with your management about, well, we want to bring in DLP. Well, what do you mean by DLP? What is your end goal? What are you trying to protect? What are you trying to monitor? What are you trying to block? And those are all conversations that you have to have with your management, your HR, your legal, and your users as well. One of the big roadblocks, you see when you start to implement a program is users start to get blocks, or they get performance hits on their system, and suddenly management decides, well, we no longer want to do this. So, there has to be buy-in from the top of like, are we trying to prevent something? Are we trying to check a box because PCI requirements say that we have to have this program in place? We have to understand, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? In some organizations, I think it's easier. If you're a financial company, you're doing it for compliance. So you're monitoring PII and financial data. And beyond that, hey, you don't really care. But like Mark touched on, right, there's a lot of data that you may be collecting or that you have on premise that you're not even really aware of. Your users, I used to work for a very large company, and we were very concerned about insider trading. So, we had tools that were looking at message boards and everything, for looking for any employee that might post something that would be considered insider trading. So it grows really quickly, but like I said, you really have to understand from your management and whoever's asking for it, what are your end goals? What are you trying to protect? What are you trying to monitor? What are you trying to do? And right now, the vast majority of the DLP products out there are really, they're much more focused on just a compliance checkbox. I have a product that you can install, and it will look for whatever data you define, but you still have to, at the end of the day, you still have to define the data that you're trying to protect, you're trying to watch. If you try to watch all of it, you're going to fail miserably, because there's so much data that's going back and forth. Every time a user is going to a cloud, either business related or personally related, there's a lot of files and data being copied back and forth. And you will overwhelm your SOC or whatever mechanism you're using really quickly if you're trying to monitor all of it. So again, it goes back to the idea of you have to prioritize. What do you really wanting to get out of it?
Thanks. And Rob, thanks for the question. Just a quick note to everyone: if you want to ask questions, feel free to just chime in. Take yourself off mute and chime in here, or just put it in the chat, and I'll try to incorporate it as I'm round robin here. One thing I wanted to touch on is just pick up what you're saying there, John. The problem that we're trying to solve, the compliance problem, I think arguably has been relatively well solved by most companies with the traditional tool set. Maybe there's some new changes with the GDPR, and the CCPA has put additional pressures on some areas of compliance. But I'm curious to know, if you just put the compliance thing aside for a minute and you just think about the other risk to the business. Mark talked in his paper about the reputational risk, the brand risk when your data is lost. There's obviously competitive risk if your intellectual property, your top secret trade secrets are leaked, right? And we have all this nation state sponsored hacking that's going on. We've seen things like, source code attempts to get at source code with supply chain attacks. So there's a broad spectrum of problems here that we're talking about. I'm curious, from your perspective, Mark, as a former CIO, not in the CISO office, but in the CIO chair, what do you think are the top data handling, data protection priorities for companies today?
So I want to start by, I'm in raging agreement with a comment that John made. You know, I think that sometimes when we talk about technologies that we can use for data protection, we talk about them in kind of a blanket fashion, right? I mean, like when these tools are effective but they're expensive, they're difficult to administer in some cases, and something we never really get too explicit about is that I don't think any of us really intend like this should be applied, you know, to every bit of PII that could exist anywhere in the company. I mean, that's to John's point. There's just too much data that's floating around. And the way we've gone about doing this in the past, you know, tagging different data sets because there's a social security number or, you know, there's some information about your prescription drugs, et cetera. It's if you step back, it's a giant game of whack-a-mole. Like you wake up every morning to go play whack-a-mole all day long and you don't have enough arms, you know, I mean, it's numerically impossible to do, right? But you go into kind of slave way of doing that. So again, so go to your question, Howard, to kind of back up, you know, I think one of the concepts you got to kind of restart your thinking around is data lineage. And, you know, really look at, to John's point, what is the most sensitive data that we have? We're going to apply these tools in a risk reduction way. We're not going to sit here and think, I can eliminate every risk to the corporation, every instance of misuse, you know, every breach path where it could be inadvertently exposed, you know, or intentionally stolen, et cetera. That's just not going to happen. But, you know, if we lost mailing addresses and zip codes, you know, that's bad, but, you know, that's out there. There's other ways people can get publicly, you know, available information like that, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what are the real crown jewels here that we need to protect? And if you can really, and this isn't going to happen overnight, but if you develop that as more of an operational philosophy, let's really focus on lineage. Let's kind of nip this thing in the bud. And then any derivative data sets, any daughter products that come from those primary data sources, they inherit knowledge about the sensitivity of the data that's there. Well, then you can come up with some pretty sophisticated safeguards that are really targeted at where the risk is the greatest, instead of trying to, you know, come up with some average level of protection across a huge data estate, which is either over-engineered in some cases or vastly under-engineered, you know, in others. So I think you have to really approach it in more of a risk reduction or risk management perspective.
Yeah. And Yaron, maybe you pick up on that, you know, in what you're dealing with today, you know, you don't have to speak specifically about your company, obviously, but we see it kind of happening in the broader marketplace. Why is now a more challenging time for this endeavor? We read a lot about the impact of work from home, the fact that all your users are now off your network. A lot of the network-based controls no longer work. A lot of data is obviously sprawled into SaaS apps more and more each day. What's creating more urgency for you as a practitioner in this market to really focus on this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it necessarily now. I mean, I think this problem has been around for a very long time, obviously, but I think it accelerates. I think it's continued to accelerate with the move to work from home, with leveraging more and more third parties. You know, in healthcare, we used to have that joke that HIPAA is about keep it private, but share it with everybody, right? Because you have to share that information with, like, you know, with insurance companies and doctors and hospitals, you know, and so on and so forth, right? So the nature of our business is such today in the digital world, it's all based on data. It's all based on data flows. So we can't really stop that, but it's accelerate, I mean, pretty quickly. And that continues to, you know, to magnify the problem. I saw the other day some stats about like how much data, you know, we've been generating back in whatever 2000s and how much data now we're generating, you know, 20 years later, right? And it's exponentially growing. And how do we keep up with that, right? So to Mark's point, I mean, we can't protect all the data everywhere, all the time, you know, around every system. But I think there are fundamentally two flaws that we as an industry kind of overlooked. I think the first one is we always try to classify the data backwards. So when I'm originally from Israel, served in the military for 5 years. I was an intelligence officer. And I remember the first class we had in intelligence school was when you take a piece of paper, and even if you just put a line on it, the very first thing you do is at the top of the page, you write the classification of that document, whether it's public or it's secret or top secret or whatever, the very first thing you do. The second thing you do is you never throw any piece of paper away. You either shred it or burn it. Now, if we take the same philosophy, to what we do today in cyber, we don't classify the data at the point of creation ever, or nearly ever. So we always try to go and do it backwards. And then, false positives, regular expressions can really do that. The first time you create a rule and you block a senior executive, or your entire DLP program is toast. It's all of that, right? And now we say, okay, well, AI will going to help us to do the classification. Well, is there a way for us to create the classification at the point of creation? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is we never shred or burn that data. Why do we keep all of that data around? Do we actually need to have all that data around all the time? So for me, again, it's going back to practices. It's going back to practices of like information lifecycle management. What do we need? What do we need to keep? For how long? How do we need to keep that, and how we're going to protect it? The last point I want to make is when you think about, how much data do we have, and how we're going to deal with all of that data. I saw a tweet some time ago, and they said data is it's not the new gold, it's the new uranium. Because like uranium, it's regulated, heavily regulated. It can have some military usage. You probably don't want to leave just uranium just kind of laying around and everything. And then a friend of mine said that, if you expose to uranium for too long, you start losing your hair. And I think that's kind of where a lot of CISOs start losing their hair because of all the data exposure they have, right? Mm-hmm. So again, fundamentally, it's kind of the same thing, right? How do we approach it, holistically and not just from a tool perspective, but like from a process, and what is the problem that we're trying to solve? That's, I think, the first thing that we need to answer.
Yeah, and we couple great comments and questions here. Jacob was just commenting, his team is really focused on trying to deal with exception management and identifying those critical and broken business processes that create these gaps. John, maybe you can kind of pick up on this comment. What do you think that's the place to start? You look at the broken business processes and see how that's creating exposure and risk for you, or what's the right way to start on this problem?
I think that's part of it. It's part of a holistic program, right? Of looking at, we're an engineering company, so intellectual property is a big part of what we do. So, we're looking for the gaps in our program. What data, what are we not monitoring currently? What do we not have visibility for? And that's a big part of what we do. So for us, DLP is, we have, endpoint protection, for malware and that kind of thing, but it's, for us, DLP is not a compliance issue. It's more of we need to know what data is flowing in and out of our users' systems. If it's in a data center, it's much easier to do, right? Because it's just sitting there in a data center. You got your firewalls, all that. You have all your internal mechanisms and walls. It's the end user systems that are hard to get visibility in. And, particularly in this day and age with users remote, and, most companies no longer require a VPN, right, to get to access. You can just use some type of authentication model and you can get to your data. So having visibility on those endpoints about what they're doing, where they're going, what their data is doing, flowing in and out, touching what cloud providers and that type of thing. So if there is an incident, does something happen, you can start pulling that thread to see, find a patient zero or whatever you want to do. But, a lot of it, like I said, is just where are our gaps in visibility and what do we need to do to fill in those gaps? Do we bring in a new tool? Is there something that we can use with an existing tool? With your SIM platforms like Splunk, right? A lot of times, it's this question of correlating data from different sources. but the hard part is in this day and age, it's your endpoint. It's your laptop. Somebody's working at a Starbucks or at home. How do you monitor what that system is doing when they're off your network? What data is coming in and out? Like Mark said, just because, if they're not touching your sensitive data doesn't mean you don't need visibility to what that data is. Most malware, is going to get into your system, by accident. That's just kind of how it happens. And you need to know where, that patient zero came from, that data flow in and out. And a lot of the difficulty, I think, is in this day and age is there's so many ways to get data in and off a system. With your, RFID to SD cards, Bluetooth, Lord, it just goes on and on and on. There's so many ways. And, someone goes to a website and they click agree to something, and now something's installed on someone's system and it's effectively doing its own monitoring. There's a lot of conversations we have about social media and the tracking that those platforms do. Even just from geographic location and information, that kind of thing. Do you really want some party to know where all of your users' systems are at any given moment? Because that's all going into the cloud and somebody can access that through an API. And just because we can't think about how that data is being used from a malicious standpoint doesn't mean it's not being used. And at any given moment, from a cybersecurity standpoint, you need to be able to say, I need to shut this off. I need to find whatever file this is on any of my systems. I need to know where it's been, where it came from, and I need to know it, in the next 12 hours. That's CISOs and that type of thing. It happens. Something happens. There's an instant security vulnerability, and suddenly it's does this pertain to us? What's our risk threshold? What's our vulnerability? We need to know. We need to know it now. And you got to know what your risks are, and to do that, you got to know what the data is, what your users are doing. You got to have visibility into it. From my standpoint, it's all about filling in the gaps of your visibility. And if you can apply controls to that, that's awesome. But at some point, you got to have visibility. The worst thing you can ever tell, anybody in management is I have no idea. I don't know. I have no visibility into that. Because their immediate question is going to be, well, why? Why don't we have visibility into that? And sometimes it's because, well, you guys didn't want to spend the money, but that's why you do risk assessments, and that's why you lay it out, and someone has to make that decision based on their risk appetite. But ultimately, it's all about visibility. You have to know what data is coming in and out of your systems.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something you just said there, John, just about quantifying the impact. So you could justify why we should spend more money on this program.
Yeah.
Right? Because always competing priorities in most companies. There's a question here also from Jacob. Probably for the whole panel, how do you measure the effectiveness of the DLP program? What do you show your CIO, your board, your CEO about what your DLP program, or whatever we want to call it? I'm going to come back to branding, what we call it in a minute, but what do you show them about this program to validate that you're getting the results that you want? Maybe Mark, we'll start with you. What did you want to see as the CIO coming from the CISO? Start from your perspective.
You sure don't want to start with somebody else? This is a much bigger question than just privacy data management, right? this is sort of the information security puzzle, which is like, what's the incremental efficacy of buying the N+1 tool, right? The N+1 tool, what percent of residual risk am I buying down by investing in that next tool, regardless of the cost or how many people I have to hire to maintain it, et cetera. Can I legitimately go to the board or to my management team or to the CFO and say, boy, if I just had this, things would be better, but like how much better? So there's not really, this isn't like the old days where you could have a standardized test for the storage, read writes on spinning disks, or just M flops on on an Intel chip or some crazy thing, and people could like compete over something that was a controlled experiment. Okay, that's sidebar aside. You know, I don't have a really good answer for you there. One thing that boards obviously are concerned about is to not be victimized in the same way that other companies have been. And so any CIO or CISO would be foolish to go before a board and not be cognizant of, you know, recent highly publicized breaches that involve data, to be able to explain to the board whatever safeguards, precautions have been instituted in their company to at least, you know, prepare for that kind of a potential problem. So I think, you know, you proactively talk about those kinds of things. But it's a tough conversation. You know, I really don't have a good answer for you this time, Howard.
Okay. What about John? You're on. What do you guys think?
I think from my standpoint, you know, a lot of times, you know, when we institute a program, particularly if we're looking for, kind of depends on what you're looking for. You know, for us, sometimes it's really easy if you institute a program and you can say, well, we've now had a, you know, 50% increase in incidents that are going to legal in HR because, well, now we have visibility into that area. Some of that stuff is really easy to quantify, but if it's just, we now have visibility into what our users are doing, you can kind of try to pull some metrics together, but it is hard to kind of quantify that to a board, particularly when you're talking about building, you know, bringing in a program, you know, building in a tool that's going to cost the board a lot of money, trying to explain to them from a money standpoint, because that's ultimately what they're concerned about, is justifying, you know, in metrics. Okay, we asked you to spend $1 million every year. You agreed to do it. Well, they're going to want to see some type of return on that, right? That they want to see some numbers of, you know, and again, it depends on what tool you're bringing in and what you're doing, but trying to quantify that to a pure dollar standpoint, that can be really difficult. But, you know, ultimately, if you can tie it to, you know, an incident of some sort of, you know, we now have visibility into this, so that would prevent or give us, you know, control over a potential, you know, flaw or attack. That's always possible. But yeah, in the end, it's really hard to quantify that. Sorry, Jan, go ahead.
So I was about to say a couple of things. I mean, for me, I think it goes back to, John, I mean, something that you mentioned earlier about what problem are we trying to solve. So start with the end in mind. And, you know, when I think about DLP today, for the most part, and then again, given a lot of the challenges that, you know, many of us here mentioned, maybe one of the main values of DLP solution, whatever your favorite is, and then I'm not using DLP as a tool. I'm using DLP kind of more as a concept. For the most part, it's mostly a deterrent. It's deterrent against your mostly insider or like, you know, good users. So if you have that inside and then you publish that you have it, that you publish that you're monitoring, that may deter some people from stealing stuff. It's not going to stop anybody who's motivated. I mean, they will find the ways around it. You know, it's not going to stop a skilled attacker. I mean, none of that. But if we can quantify and show in a meaningful way that, hey, you know, before we had that solution, so many things were happening. And now that we have those solutions, we see users taking data out through USBs, through removable media, through whatever. Okay, now I can quantify it. And then now I can start publicizing and then maybe doing some things that may deter some of them from doing it. I can show some quantifiable measure of that. Now, does that require us to invest in an expensive tool? Maybe. But that's, you know, that's kind of one way to look at it. The other way to look at it, to kind of Mark's point about the risk and the risk reduction, I think it's how we ultimately map, you know, the organizational risks, and this is not always easy, but how do we map the organizational risks to the investments that we are going to make? So if I think about an organization and say, okay, you know, this organization has a lot of PHI, you know, health information, health records, right? And if I believe that the inherent risk for that PHI, because of what we have in the organization or what we don't have, and how we work and everything is high, the likelihood, I mean, to compromise it is high, and the impact is going to be high because it's going to be well publicized, and you're going to end up with state attorney generals, you know, et cetera, I mean, regulators, you know, and so on. Okay, that's high. The inherent is right if I don't do anything. Now the next step will be, okay, how do I model specific attacks and specific threats that can compromise or actually accomplish that risk, theoretically. And once I have these 10 ways to do that, now I'm going to go and attack myself and actually try to prove if I can actually compromise myself using those 10 ways. And if the answer is yes, then I can go back and say, look, I tried 10 times, I compromised us 10 times, we're in a bad spot. I mean, we have some gaps here, the gaps, here's what we need to do. After that, maybe we're going to do some things. We're going to improve some of the controls. We're going to run again those 10, scenarios, simulations. Maybe we stop 2, and we still have 8 open. Okay, not great, but I can now quantifiably show that I addressed 2 more, and then I have some more way to go. I think that's going to be an easier conversation to have with executive, with the board, and so on. The challenge with that, it's not easy and it's not fast. So it takes time to get there, and sometimes you're even so constrained because you don't even have the tools to give you that data. I remember a few jobs ago, my CIO asked me, not the current one, few one back, and he said, "What are you going to accomplish in the first 90 days?" And my answer was like, "You guys didn't do anything for like 80 years. I mean, what do you want me to do in like 90 days? I mean, I'm going to tell you how I feel about it, but that's about it, right?" But I think for a lot of security, for a lot of companies and a lot of security practitioners, when they walk into an organization, and unfortunately security many times is still an afterthought, there's all this pressure, to get things done very, very quickly. And the problem is so big that you can't do a lot of things, very, very quickly. So it's really kind of finding that balance and trying to identify what the risks are and what kind of give you the most bang for the buck. And what I keep telling my team, it's never going to be perfect. I know as security people would love to find like all the edge cases, and if it's not 100% perfect, we don't want to do it. But even if we do it 10%, make it 10% better, we're still 10% better. So it's all about like, hey, let's continuously improve, let's continuously deliver, and it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's going to be a while, and it's probably going to continue, with our successors, and so on. To work on that. So not easy and not fast, unfortunately.
So Howard, let me jump back in. I have a better answer now that I had a chance to listen to Yaron and John. So I thought John brought up a good point. Coverage is an important metric from a board's point of view. So if you don't have visibility into some way data is being used and a tool can provide that visibility, you can report that kind of a metric to a board saying, we only see 60% of these flows now, and by this new tool, I'll have 85% coverage. Boards respond pretty positively to that. And then, I kind of hate to say this, but there's also a copycat mentality. Really, at the end of the day, the board wants to make sure that it can demonstrate that it took prudent precautions, right? Not that necessarily was able to guarantee the total security of all the information in the company. And so if you take an example like the SolarWinds, highly publicized event, it's pretty easy to go to a board these days and say, hey, I want to beef up my vendor supplier, information security safeguards that I've got in place, and I want to make some investments and put a new tool in. So I think as long as a board can say, hey, we recognized the problem, we made some investments. Hey, maybe they didn't work. Maybe something fell through the cracks in the way we implemented them, et cetera. But we can't be charged with gross negligence that we didn't step up and try to do something about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's some really good stuff going on in chat here for those of you who are following along. A couple other ideas from the audience. Rob with a suggestion about the time to respond and time to resolve metric as another one, because I think there's some data by vendors that show the longer the incident goes, the more damage and the more costly it is. So that clearly is a great metric. The other one that Jacob pointed out is just a percentage of data that's covered. And Mark, you just touched on this, your coverage. It's an interesting question, because in order to really prove coverage, you have to know what the denominator is. How do you know what the denominator is when you have so much data sprawl? So I'd be curious, how do you think about coverage when it's almost like an infinite denominator these days? Maybe I'll have Yaron, you start, and then John go next.
Yeah, I think so. Part of it, again, I know we are still looking for all those silver bullets and sophisticated new security approaches and everything. It goes back to the foundations. if you take like, CIS top 20 control, 1 and 2, where your applications are, where your inventories, sorry, where your devices are, where your applications are. I would also add 2.5 where your data is, right? I mean, we need to know where that inventory is. It's much more difficult with data, but I think knowing, first of all, what we have and what we need to protect, that's 101. I think that's where most of us struggle with. And unless we get a good grasp on that somehow, and again, doesn't have to be perfect, but we get grasp on that, I think we're going to continue to struggle.
What about you, John? What do you think on coverage?
I'd agree with that. Ultimately, and every organization is different, but you have to define that data, and that has to happen before you even bring in a tool or start looking at a tool. You have to understand, and either, I've seen places do it by animal names or color code or whatever, but you have to, tier 1 down through of what data is your crown jewels. What is the data that cannot ever leave your control versus, just kind of go down that. And you have to understand what that data is, and you have to classify that and have risks, associated with it. And that's something, I think a lot of organizations struggle with. I think it depends on the organization and kind of what they're doing. Like I said, most of my career has been with engineering companies. So it's much easier to decide, intellectual property, right? That's the crown jewels that can never, our chip designs can never leave our control. We have to, that beyond that, we don't really care. That's much easier to draw a circle around. But then you start, as your program grows, then you're like, well, what about your HR data, your financial information? One of the interesting things that I think has come out with some of the recent hacks, particularly by nation states, is the whole idea of short selling a company. That some of these hackers, the goal is not really to get your IP, it's to basically publicly embarrass the company so your stock drops, and then they will make millions of dollars because they short sold your stock. That happened with Sony, right? The whole idea that we can just a hacker can just get compromising emails and publish that. Don't get me started with Facebook, but that's in the news right now, is the massive Facebook data hack. But that data has been around. It's old, right? It's not like this is a recent wow. No one's surprised, but their stock price is going to take a hit. So hackers who are savvy are going to plan that out. They're going to make those decisions. So it gets really tricky about, and again, it comes down to your risk appetite of, what are you really trying to protect? If it's all about your reputation, how important is your reputation? And some of it's basic hygiene. Yaron touched on about that. It's about, you got to have a program and a philosophy in place to begin with, of what is your data, what are you really trying to protect, what are your priorities, and then that drives the spend, right? Otherwise, it gets kind of out of control and willy-nilly. I remember, when I first started in this business, the whole idea of even like having users regularly change their passwords was like a long conversation. Like that was like, well, we don't really want to do that. That's going to really make it hard for them to get work done. And so, you got to have those conversations, and you got to make some decisions based on that. The more you got to have some levels of control, and every organization is going to be different. But at some point, your upper management, your board of directors, they have to have that conversation about what are they willing to do, what are they willing to spend. And I've worked for companies, like I said, that they were willing to spend any amount of money to protect their IP. They didn't care. They were like, oh, we don't care how much it costs, just do it. And I worked for companies that didn't care. They literally were like, unless it's required by compliance, we're not going to spend a penny on it, because at the end of the day, we'll just scratch the company and shut it down, other than spend a dime. And every company is different. And when you look for jobs, those are important questions to ask the company and that management about what is their priorities. Do they have what type of risk controls do they have? What questions are important to them? And it's part of the philosophy. And every company is a little different. Most companies are very concerned about their data, but it's going past that of what is really important to you. What do you want to spend your money on, and prioritizing, that spend. Like I said, some of the basic hygiene, honestly, if everyone just patched their damn systems and reboot them on a regular basis, we would avoid so much problems, you know, in the security world. You know, beyond that, if users would stop clicking on stuff, that would be great too. But ultimately, yeah, it's like good luck on that. But you know, it's about, you know, you got to have visibility and you got to have controls. But beyond that, it's a question of defining, you know, what controls are important to you and how much money are you willing to spend to get that control.
Yeah.
And John, I just wanted like a quick comment to that.
Yeah.
And I agree with everything you said. And I think there's like one more dimension is, you know, do no harm, right? I mean, there are a lot of companies that are willing to take the risk, but if you think about, okay, it's not just the record, that piece of data, there's a human being on the other side of that record. And you have to think about how a compromise will actually impact the life of that human being. You know, if you talk about like, you know, mental health institutions and things like that, where if that data has been compromised, you can actually have like a deadly impact on a person, right? And unfortunately, I mean, you know, our healthcare system is not known to be like very secure or like at the top when it comes to security. This is, you know, one of the things that I commend everybody who works in healthcare and just kind of carrying that flag and mission for like, we have to protect the people. So this is something that I know many companies don't think about. And maybe it's not relevant for a lot of companies, like you said, intellectual property, whatever, it's money loss, okay. But when it's people, when you're dealing with people and you can impact their lives, and there are organizations that with that data you can impact people's lives, I think they have I think the bar has to be much, much higher for these companies.
Yeah, it's a great point, Yaron. It is life or death in many cases, you know, as it pertains to this data. One thing I wanted to ask you about is, and maybe I'll start with Mark, because you've actually attempted to rebrand this category, you know, coin it, give it a new name. You call it data misuse protection, the name of your paper. I saw another, someone else here kind of in the chat said that they rebranded to data protection services. How should this audience here think about what they call their effort? Because I think what they brand it as and how they communicate the scope of the program, their goals behind the program, a lot of it has to do with what they're calling it. What do you think about the branding, and why did you settle on data misuse protection?
Kind of goes back to where we started our conversation, that there are so many liabilities associated with misuse of privacy data. You know, and your own just, you know, highlighted some of the more significant ones, profound ones that can occur. And I think sometimes that just kind of, those considerations get lost in the conversation because everybody wants to talk about a breach, right? And what have we done to prevent a breach? We read about breaches all the time. And I guess, you know, this is obvious as well, but I'm going to go ahead and go there. The way we operate today around privacy, with like these nonsensical privacy corporate statements that appear on websites that say, we're collecting this information so you have a better experience online, or so, you know, we can offer you a better product in the future. That doesn't mean anything to anybody, you know, like that doesn't, so you read that and you go, oh, okay, well, what should I feel good or bad about after kind of reading this? Some of them are written in such legalese that it almost begs the question, like, oh my God, they're writing something, you know, on me here. Like, I can tell this is so highly qualified that they must be doing something bad with my data. They're just protecting themselves, you know. It actually creates more paranoia than reassurance, the way that the privacy statement has been written. Anyway, that's a long way of saying, I think if you look into the future, what's going to happen is commercial enterprises are going to have to be a little more specific about the generic uses that data is going to be put to, whether it's to provide better customer service to, you know, a consumer, whether it's to improve an existing product or service that the consumer is, you know, experiencing, whether it's to provide them maybe exclusive access to merchandise in the future, or shipping waivers, or, you know, pricing discounts, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think these kind of like, you know, blanket permissions are going to be acceptable. And then the other kind of soapbox that I've been on for a while, you know, we always talk about privacy in this like generic way, right? That the privacy concerns of people of different age, race, health, wealth, political persuasion, ethnicity, et cetera, are just kind of like, you know, homogenized, like it's a privacy metric that we need to meet. And I think we all know of members of our own families who have very different concerns about the way in which they're comfortable having their data used. And those concerns change over time as people age and become wealthier or unhealthier or have children or whatever. And so, I mean, privacy concerns are a dynamic metric that you're trying to address. And I think, I heard a comment the other day, which I'll share with the group. And somebody told me, he said, we spent the last 5 years trying to build these rich online customer experiences, through a whole set of e-commerce tools and mobile applications, et cetera, et cetera. He said, I think the next 5 years, we're going to be building privacy experiences. And the company that, can foster the greatest sense of trust on the part of the people who are interacting with it online, are going to be the winners long term. And we all need to come up with far more personalized, customized, richer ways of assuring people that their data is not being misused.
Yep. What do you think, Yaron? How should we think about this problem from a branding perspective? What should we call
it? I think it shouldn't be called data loss prevention. I mean, I think that's the wrong message that we're sending out there. I think it should be just simple as, data protection. And under this umbrella of data protection, it may mean different things to different companies. I mean, if you're a healthcare organization and you have critical PHI, that may mean one thing. If you are an organization that is dealing with intellectual property, that mean a second thing. And if you're dealing with money or financial institution, that means a third thing. But you can map it back to your risk. But ultimately, it's that data protection that tied back to your risk. And your risk appetite is going to change. If it's a person, it's going to be very high. I mean, I'm not going to have a lot of appetite for risk. If it's money, maybe I'm going to have a little bit more. So I would take everything that has to do with like loss or anything like that and just focus on the protection.
Okay. Let me just pause. We have about a little more than 5 minutes left. Any questions from the audience that you want to ask any of our panelists? No? Okay.
Yeah, this is Robin from L3 Harris. If I can ask a quick question.
Go for it, Rob.
A lot of us, we come in and we start, with an existing or an established either a DLP program or a data categorization or data protection. If you had your dream greenfield, and any one of the members can answer this. If you had your dream greenfield start from scratch, what would the first thing that you would do if you were trying to tackle this problem? No legacy, no existing infrastructure, your greenfield all the way.
Maybe John, maybe start with you.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of factors in there, right? Because there's always the pie in the sky, the best tool out there versus the most cost effective versus the performance and that kind of thing. There's an argument. This is something I'm actually looking at it in our environment, right? If you're a pure Windows environment, right? There's a lot of Windows tools that are all integrated into Windows 10, right? And if you're talking about a very clean program and platform, you could do that, right? Use all the Microsoft tools. They have a lot of security tools and kind of not by standards, DLP, but they do have a lot of tools that can track, all the data movement on a Windows 10 machine and put that into the cloud and that kind of thing. So from a clean, price standpoint, like a purely integrated platform like that can make a lot of sense. It may not be a lot of best of breed, but you're not going to have a performance impact. You're not going to deal with your third-party agents and APIs. Hey, that sounds really good. But beyond that, though, taking a step back from that, cost standpoint, the main thing is you need something that will give you visibility into your data flows in and out. You can see where the data came from and where it was going, who started what, when, and where, and can't really get into the how or why. Well, kind of the how, but not the why. And you want to be able to track that and be able to log that. And whatever tool gives you that visibility, that's kind of what you want to go with. Beyond, if there's no price involved, that's what you want. If that means it's a built-in something into your OS, that's awesome. If it's a third-party tool, then that's what you got to do. But but ultimately, you want something that has little to no impact on the system performance, and it gives you, maximum visibility into your data flows. And for me, beyond that, once I have visibility, I can tweak it. I can control and I can slide, up and down the alerts I get and that kind of thing. But first things first, I got to have visibility. I need to see what data is coming in and out of the system.
Thanks, John. What about you, Ron? Where would you start?
Well, Mark probably is going to be happy to hear that about his previous hat, but I would probably start with the identity side, the identity and access management. Assuming I had like greenfield with like nothing, but understand like, who the users are and what they can or should do, and how do we manage their access. That's probably my first choice.
Okay. Just in the interest of time, I'm just going to squeeze in one other question from Chris. Have you tried coupling DRM with DLP? So protecting data even after it's out of your control, after it leaves your organization, and it's governing the use of that data, digital rights management as it was once known. Have any of you, the three panelists, had experience with that?
I have tried in the past. There are several technologies we looked at. What we ran into was adoption by the users. It wasn't intuitive for the users to adopt and use, so we got fairly low adoption, so we didn't continue with the program, but that was about it.
Yeah, I worked for a company. We basically did some data tagging on specific data. Basically any data in several shares would automatically be tagged. And then we actually had a third-party company that basically monitored looking for those tags in the wild. And we would occasionally get, a report back saying, someone was trying to sell this, this tag data, on the dark web, and then we would basically pull the string backwards to see kind of how it got out there. But, it's not, again, it comes down to someone's got to classify the data. Someone needs to know what data are you really wanting to tag and what the cost is. And like Yaron says, right, I mean, if it's all data in a share, that's great. But if you don't have good controls or access controls, then if someone, is creating data that's supposed to be in that share and they're not actually putting it in that share, then it's not working. So you have to have controls, be it, like I said, like Howard said, right, it's some type of DRM control. That's user has to check in and check out data from a controlled share. There has to be some accessibility controls in place. And then of course, there's the user experience, then users don't want to do it because it's a pain. So then users are notorious. If it's a pain, they will find a way to get around it. And then you have to be able to monitor that, are they actually using it? It can snowball really quickly. So, at some point it's, what's the cost and what's the risk involved? But yeah, DRM, I've not seen a great DRM system, but I'm sure they're out there, but not in my personal experience.
Okay. Yeah, we're at the top of the hour, so just quick final parting thoughts with any advice or any encouragement you can provide, because this is a very tough problem. Mark, maybe just a quick final thought from you.
Quick one, I'll go back to Rob's question, when he asked about the one tool. So if I were to land in a CISO or CIO job, first of all, you'll never have a clean slate. You're going to inherit, your grandmother's attic of tools. And I collect a list of all the tools and what we paid for them. And I'd go into the CFO and I'd say, I'm not going to come at you for another budget cycle until I can figure out what the hell we're doing with all the stuff that we already bought. And I would say, I'm going to go try to nip the problem at the source. We've touched on some really basic hygienic principles right in this conversation about figuring out what's really sensitive, getting it tagged in the primary data asset so that can be inherited downstream, managing authentication and authorization privileges, enforcing existing retention policies. It kind of reminds me of the annual Verizon breach report, where the annual recommendation is, gee, if you just patch servers and you do a better job of managing credentials, that's 80% of the problem. Well, it applies to this field as well. If you practice some of the basic hygiene, and we've touched on many of these foundational principles today, you can probably get rid of a couple of tools and the CFO will love you for the next few cycles.
Okay, thanks. Yaron, final quick thought from you?
Yeah, change data with uranium every time you think about it, and then draw your conclusions from there.
Okay, John? John, you're on mute.
There we go. I totally agree with what Mark was saying. If you can address the basic hygiene, you're patching your systems, you're rebooting your systems, you got solid authentication, you got least privilege in place, you know, you don't need tools to do that. And you can, you know, really lock down a lot of stuff. You can eliminate most of your problems just by addressing basic hygiene and basic controls. You know, the CIA, you know, tripod, right? If you can address those three things before you can look at tools, you're way ahead of the curve.
Thank you. Well, that was a great meeting. I think our audience, hopefully you all got something really valuable out of that. I learned a lot. It was fun. It was insightful. Want to extend my deep gratitude to Mark, Yaron, and John taking time out of their busy days to join us here and share with you their insights. And we hope for everyone else in the audience, we'll have a chance to talk with you about your project in the near future. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Sounds good.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Have a good one.